Part 4. The Practical Uses of Mental Illness. Chapter 9. Mental Illness as Strategy. You are to use the word purely as an incantation, if you like, purely for its selling power. C.S. Lewis. Sometimes the term mental illness is used as if it designated an identifiable condition like diabetes or a pattern of habitual behavior like neatness. An organic psychosis is indeed such a condition, and anorexia nervosa is indeed such a pattern of behavior. More often, however, the term refers to a strategy rather than a condition, exemplified by the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry's GAP definition of mental illness as an illness which so lessens the capacity of a person to use, maintain his judgment, discretion, and control in the conduct of his affairs and social relations as to warrant his commitment to a mental institution. The GAP advances this definition as if it were describing a disease, when in fact it is prescribing a disposition. Definitions: descriptive and dispositional. Every person of average intelligence and education knows that language may be used in two quite different modes, namely to assert or describe and to advocate or prescribe. For example, we can say, "The door is closed," or "Please close the door." Although the difference between these two modes of communication is obvious, misunderstanding or denying it lies at the heart of much of the confusion and controversy concerning psychiatric matters. As I have noted, the phrase mental illness appears to refer to a condition, but typically refers to a strategy. Or, to put it differently, mental illness terms are often used as if they were descriptions of psychopathological conditions from which individuals suffer, when, in fact, they function as prescriptions for how individuals allegedly suffering from such conditions should be treated by others. I point here to a simple but officially forbidden truth about psychiatry, namely, that its practitioners often first decide what to do about a person and then discover the appropriate diagnostic label with which to justify their decision. For example, if a psychiatrist wants to commit a person, he discovers that the patient is dangerously psychotic. If he wants to get him acquitted of a criminal charge by reason of insanity, he discovers that the patient was at the precise moment of his criminal act suffering from a mental illness that deprived him of criminal responsibility. If he wants to provide an abortion for a woman in a country where the only legal abortions are those deemed to be therapeutic, then he discovers that she suffers from a mental illness for which the indicated treatment is an abortion. One of the advantages or disadvantages of focusing on the strategic meanings of mental illness terms is that it frees us from having to decide whether statements using such terms are true or false. The sentence, "Please close the door," is neither true nor false. Instead, it is a command or injunction, expressing a desire and prescribing an action. We may approve or disapprove the desire, obey or disobey the order. When asked to close the door, we may reply, "Yes, sir," right away. Or, "I understand you want the door closed, but I prefer that it stay open." Or, "If you want the door closed, you close it." However, it would be nonsensical to say, "You are right." Let us apply these considerations to some of the confusions concerning mental illness. Suppose someone says, "Jones suffers from schizophrenia." As a descriptive statement, we could agree or disagree and hence say something like, "Yes, you are right, he does," or "No, you have made a mistake, he does not." Both answers imply that schizophrenia exists, that Jones may or may not have it, and that even if Jones does not have it, some other people do. However, both answers are misleading and mistaken because the sentence "Jones suffers from schizophrenia" is only seemingly descriptive, but is actually prescriptive. Its prescriptive meaning may be any of the following. Jones should be confined in a mental hospital, should be acquitted as insane of the crimes he has committed, should not be taken seriously for the views he holds, and so forth. Once we have translated mental illness from description to prescription, we no longer have to accept or reject the assertion about mental illness. See Chapter 11. We are now liberated, so to speak, to respond to the injunction previously implicit but now explicit, with a clear rejoinder of our own concerning the recommended action. Perhaps the most obvious use of the idea of mental illness occurs in the context of commitment, exemplified in my initial example of the GAP's definition of it as, in effect, committability. To see clearly why this is not a definition of a condition, we need to construct an analogous definition of, say, myocardial infarction. A coronary occlusion would then be defined as a disease which so lessens the competence of a person's cardiac function as to warrant his observation in a hospital's intensive care unit. Although such a statement describes what may happen to a person as a consequence of his suffering a heart attack, no cardiologist would accept it as a definition of the disease called myocardial infarction. So, we must go back to our starting point, the fact that the central epistemological muddle of psychiatry derives from the fact that while the term mental illness seemingly refers to an abnormality or illness similar to or identical with a bodily disease, in fact it denotes no objectively identifiable condition or phenomenon. Accordingly, in keeping with the principle that the meaning of an abstract noun such as insanity must be inferred from its actual use, I shall now identify, describe, and illustrate the principal uses meanings of mental illness. Since mental illness functions mainly as a strategic term, I have already touched on some of its such uses, and will touch on others in the chapters that follow. Mental illness as accusation or incrimination. Descriptions of the psychoses in psychiatric textbooks are a rich source of illustrations of the accusatory uses meanings of mental illness terms, as the following cases, culled from Noy's Modern Clinical Psychiatry, 7th ed., illustrate. The first story begins with this sentence. PG was committed to a hospital for mental disease because of his peculiar religious ideas and rites, one of them being the practice of going about nude. If we look at this sentence without any psychiatric prejudgments, it makes very little sense. In the first place, every religious idea is peculiar to those who do not share it. Furthermore, in free societies, holding peculiar religious ideas is considered to be an essential aspect of individual liberty and political freedom. Lastly, the meaning of going about nude depends on the context. In one's own home, it is a right. In a public place, it is a crime. Thus, from the very first sentence of this case history, we are confronted with a psychiatric account that purports to describe an illness, psychosis, a so-called patient has, while actually it justifies an act in which a psychiatrist engages, commitment. In this account, we also get a glimpse of the collusion between patient and psychiatrist concerning the commitment. About this time, when he was 40 years old, he began to go to isolated spots and to walk about nude, explaining that he was taking sun baths. Gradually, he made fewer attempts to retire from sight when taking his sun baths. Finally, after having been warned on repeated occasions by the local constable that he must not continue his exhibitionistic practices, the patient was committed to a hospital for mental disorders. The method in this madness is obvious enough. Evidently, this person wanted to drop out of the game of competitive adulthood and proceeded to do so in the manner prescribed in our society. To show that this pattern is typical rather than isolated, I shall cite two more case histories from the same textbook, illustrating similar collusions between psychotic and psychiatrist culminating in commitment. The patient, AR, diagnosed as suffering from simple schizophrenia, was first a poor student and then a poor worker. When he reached the age of 19, he gave up his job as a machine operator in a factory and showed no further interest in securing employment. When asked if he worked, he replied, "What do I want to work for? I have a father and sister working, and they are enough." He appeared quite self-satisfied and felt that he should have a position of importance. At this point, AR was arrested for peeping into women's bedrooms. Through the influence of his father, the charge was dropped. A year later, he was again arrested, but again was released on the intercession of his father. Since these strategies failed to achieve what seemed to be their intended effect, the patient escalated his symptoms. He came to say little unless addressed and grew antagonistic toward his father and sister. He would remain out until midnight and then come home, eat a large meal, read until 2 a.m., and sleep until noon. Finally, after his third arrest for peeping, he was committed to a hospital for mental disorders. Such a case illustrates, comments Kolb, how an individual is unable to complete the transition from adolescence to maturity with its adult heterosexual and social adjustments. That may or may not be true. Kolb does not know, nor do I, whether this man was unable or unwilling to make this transition. In any case, I maintain that the imagery of illness and helplessness attached to such an individual functions as a justification for this particular psychiatric method of handling the problem. To be sure, in this sort of case, the patient incriminates himself as a mental patient. After he does so long enough and persistently enough, his self-incrimination is given official sanction. He is diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia and is committed. The case history Kolb offers as typical of catatonic schizophrenia exhibits a similar pattern. The patient married when he was 20 and stopped working when he was 24. We are not told who supported him after that. What we are told is this. 2 months before commitment, the patient began to talk about how he had failed, had spoiled his whole life, that it was now too late. He spoke of hearing someone say, "You must submit." One night his wife was awakened by his talking. He told her of having several visions but refused to describe them. He stated that someone was after turn and trying to blame him for the death of a certain man. He had been poisoned, he said. He had periods of laughing and shouting and became so noisy and unmanageable that it was necessary to commit him. Again, the pattern seems clear enough. The patient produces symptoms which have the effect of coercing those about him to do something, hopefully to take care of him. Sooner or later, psychiatrists are called on to produce a diagnosis of mental illness, which has the effect of counter-coercing the patient into commitment. Some of the foregoing examples may seem dated, and indeed they are. I cite them to illustrate the paradigmatic strategic meaning use of mental illness. At the moment, it is legally and psychiatrically fashionable to commit only those persons whose mental illness renders them dangerous to themselves or others. Accordingly, psychiatrists now manipulate the psychiatric vocabulary so as to justify forcibly ejecting chronic mental patients from state mental hospitals, a process they call deinstitutionalization. Not surprisingly, people now complain that psychiatrists refrain too much from committing crazy people, with the result that the patients end up in prison. The following comment in the New York Times is typical. To get someone committed, the patient has to behave in a way that would get the same person arrested. Not eating, wandering the streets, refusing medical or psychiatric care are not considered legal causes for commitment. We criticize the Soviet Union for institutionalizing political dissidents while we send our mentally ill to prisons. The fact that the problems to which this writer refers have nothing to do with medicine, illness, and treatment, but have everything to do with poverty, homelessness, and social deviance seems to get lost in the effort, in which nearly everyone now seems to want to participate, to manipulate the psychiatric vocabulary, and with it, both the psychiatrist and the mental patient. Mental illness as excuse or exoneration. For obvious reasons, mental illness terms are used to excuse or exculpate only in situations where a person has committed an illegal act or is accused of having committed such an act. People do not plead insanity for engaging in legal acts or meritorious deeds. Before it was fashionable to plead insanity, it was customary to plead demonic possession. Indeed, current pleas of insanity do not differ much from old-fashioned pleas of demonic possession, as the following stories illustrate. In 1974, a 47-year-old Phoenix, Arizona man rammed his car into the front door of St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church, then ran up the aisle and began destroying altar pieces. It took 8 parishioners to restrain him. The police took him to the local psychiatric hospital, where he told the officers, "I was possessed by the devil, and he made me do it." The same claim made in 1981 by a young man in Connecticut charged with murder was supported not only by his relatives and friends, but by his attorney as well. On February 16, 1981, Arne Cheyenne Johnson got into an argument with Alan Bono and stabbed him to death. According to the New York Times, the case involves a family that seems utterly convinced of the devil's presence in their house and a defense attorney who intends to force evidence of that influence onto the court. The courts have dealt with the existence of God, says Martin Minella, the attorney. Now they're going to have to deal with the existence of the devil. Johnson's girlfriend, Deborah Glatzel, told the lawyer and the reporters that her brother had said that he had seen the beast devil go into Cheyenne's body and it was the beast who had committed the crime. The reporter for The Times notes that this case arises at a time when there is a growing belief in the country in religion and cites a national Gallup poll which showed that 34% of adults believe that the devil is a personal being who directs evil forces and influences people to do wrong. Of course, most of the remaining 66% of adults no doubt know it is mental illness that does it. In 1980, Michael Tyndall, who had served as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, was charged with taking part in smuggling hashish from Morocco to Gloucester, Massachusetts. He insisted that he did it because of a need to relive the excitement he experienced in combat, and that this need was a symptom of his illness, the Vietnam Syndrome. In September 1980, a federal court jury in Boston acquitted Tyndall of the charges against him. It was, reported a combined AP-UPI dispatch, the first time the Vietnam Syndrome, an emotional malady recognized by the American Psychiatric Association and the Veterans Administration as post-traumatic stress, had been used successfully as a defense in connection with a premeditated crime. The assertion that being possessed by mental illness, rather than by the devil, excuses one from crime is stated in a more pretentious way by various legal formulas for determining the criminal responsibility of persons suspected of being insane. The Durham Rule, for example, asserts that an accused is not criminally responsible if his unlawful act was the product of mental disease or mental defect. It is important to keep in mind that all tests for the criminal responsibility of allegedly insane defendants rest on the premise that mental illnesses exist and cause people to commit illegal acts. While such a strategy of psychiatric mercy may now seem humane or even scientific to many people, it is in fact neither, as William Blackstone, the great English jurist, recognized more than 200 years ago. But this excuse, lunacy, ought not be strained to the length to which our coroner's juries are apt to carry it, viz., that every act of suicide is an evidence of insanity, as if every man who acts contrary to reason had no reason at all. For the same argument would prove every other criminal non-compos, as well as the self-murderer. Blackstone was referring, of course, to the novel strategy of evading the harsh punishments of the law against suicide by posthumously diagnosing the Reshming, offender victim, as a lunatic. Perhaps because in those cases there was no question of psychiatrically examining the so-called patient, the strategic character of the diagnosis was clearer then than it is now. Indeed, the evidence suggests that the strategic character of the idea of mental illness has been successfully obliterated from the consciousness of the modern intellectual. Consider by way of example the debate now raging among psychiatrists, medical ethicists, lawyers, and television commentators concerning the latest psychiatric dilemma, namely mental illness in a death row inmate. Can a mentally ill person be executed? If not, should he receive appropriate treatment so that he may be? This dilemma derives from the fact that, in American law, sanity is a requirement not only for executing a valid last will, but also for being validly executed. This requirement rests on two interconnected premises. One is that it is considered morally wrong to execute a person who does not understand he is about to die or the reasons for it. The other is that a seriously mentally ill person is considered to be just such a person. Obviously, this situation represents an irresistible invitation to death row inmates as well as their self-appointed benefactors for offering mental incapacity as an excuse. If the prisoner does not want to be executed, all he has to do is act crazy. If his lawyer does not want him executed, all he has to do is claim his client is crazy. In either case, officials are confronted with the question, is the prisoner psychiatrically fit to be executed? Is he genuinely insane or only faking insanity? See Chapter 5. As we saw, it is not easy to tell the difference. Lay people can't do it, lawyers can't do it, only psychiatrists can do it. Here is a current example. In 1974, Alvin Ford, then 24, killed a policeman while robbing a Red Lobster restaurant in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, tried and sentenced to death. Ford has spent the past 11 years on death row in the Florida State Prison. I do not know whether Ford prefers to be executed or imprisoned for the rest of his life. All I know is what I read in the newspapers, which say that Ford's lawyers claim he is insane and hence mentally unfit to be executed. Although lawyers and legal scholars never tire of telling us that insanity is a legal term without psychiatric significance, no sooner do they raise the question of insanity than they call for psychiatrists to verify their claim. Ford's lawyers hired some shrinks who, not surprisingly, found Ford to be stark raving mad, a paranoid schizophrenic, so armed. Ford's lawyers petitioned Governor Robert Graham to declare Ford unfit for execution. What could the governor do but hire his own shrinks? He got 3 of them. They examined Ford, and mirabile dictu, all 3 found him to be fit as a fiddle for execution. Does this mean that they found him to be sane? Not quite. No red-blooded American psychiatrist finds anyone sane, much less a murderer. Sane people don't kill. Only insane people do. Every sane person knows that. So what did these scientists of the mind find? Before answering this question, let me mention the behavior Alvin Ford is allegedly exhibiting. Undoubtedly, by our usual standards of behavior, Ford is acting pretty crazy. The trouble is, we have no criteria for what constitutes normal behavior on death row. What would psychiatrists consider to be mentally healthy behavior on the part of a person who has seen fellow inmates executed and twice come within hours of execution himself, as Ford has? Actually, anyone familiar with Freudian ideas concerning adaptation to extreme stress by denial might say that Ford has coped quite well. He states, "I am not going to die. I'm the one who's in charge here. I make them put people in jail. I'm going to decide who gets killed." According to court records, when one of the state-appointed psychiatrists asked him, "Are you crazy?" Ford replied, "Are you crazy?" What then did the governor's psychiatrists find? 2 found him to be psychotic, but competent for execution. The third concluded that Ford's disorder was contrived and recently learned, in short, that he was malingering. He too found Ford to be mentally competent to be executed. Ford's fate is now in the hands of America's demigods, the justices of the United States Supreme Court. They are, of course, experts on mental illness, just as they had been experts on slavery. See Chapter 11. To assist them in their deliberations, the APA lost no time filing an amicus brief on behalf of Ford. A 30-minute interview, complained the psycho quacks, is inadequate to determine a prisoner's competency to be executed and violates his due process rights. This assertion implies that a longer and differently structured interview would be adequate for determining, by psychiatric methods, whether or not a prisoner is mentally competent to be executed. We have been through this before. First, the psycho quacks claimed special professional competence to determine whether a defendant, at the precise moment when he committed a crime, could or could not form the intent to commit a crime. Then, they claimed such competence to determine whether a defendant, at the time of trial, is or is not mentally fit to be tried. Now, they claim such competence to determine whether a prisoner on death row is or is not mentally fit to be executed. I continue to maintain, however, that unlike the competence of the kidneys to secrete urine, competence to be executed is not the sort of thing for which a physician can examine a patient. The psychiatric examination is a charade to obscure the practical and moral problems at hand and the strategic character of the psychiatric intervention used to evade it. The stupid mistake or stubborn strategy, the reader must decide which of viewing insanity as a treatable illness rather than as a tactical maneuver leads to an important further step in cases such as Ford's. Several such cases have been reported in the press during the past year. A prisoner on death row awaiting execution presents a practical problem for the authorities, such as governors and justices of the Supreme Court, who are, de facto as well de jure, in charge of his life and death. They have only 2 options. They must treat the prisoner either as sane and fit for execution or as insane and unfit for it. If they decide he is sane, they choose to execute a man who has been declared to be mentally ill and unfit for execution by, so some will say, conscientious, honorable, incorruptible medical professionals. On the other hand, if they decide he is insane, then according to currently prevailing forensic psychiatric standards and policies, they are obligated to ensure that he receives appropriate psychiatric treatment for his illness, no doubt from equally conscientious, honorable, incorruptible medical professionals. For what ultimate purpose? To make the prisoner sane enough so that he can be killed with the blessings of the rule of American law and the science of American psychiatry. Although this dilemma clearly exposes the absurdity of the claim that mental illness is an illness, like any other, and although it clearly reveals that, under such circumstances, the claim of mental illness or mental health functions as a purely strategic device, all this is not only ignored, but inverted into further evidence of our need for psychiatric expertise. Indeed, the existential cannibals are already feasting on their prey. How, ask two experts on such matters, will the staff of a state mental hospital respond when they realize that successful treatment means the patient will die? Moreover, according to a report in Psychiatric News, the patient's right to refuse treatment and the issue of informed consent further complicate such cases. But not to worry, the experts have a solution. All inmates found incompetent to be executed should automatically be sentenced to life imprisonment. Otherwise, treatment of such prisoners would erode hospital morale. Can the fakeries of psychiatry become any more brazen than this? I submit that instead of asking priests how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, we are now asking psychiatrists whether it is ethical for a physician to restore the sanity of an insane inmate on death row. The CAT scan, no doubt, will give us the answer. Mental illness as denial of moral conflict and evasion of personal responsibility. The acts of accusing and excusing, inculpating and exculpating usually involve clear-cut issues and situations in which individuals are blamed or forgiven. But in certain situations involving moral conflicts and questions of personal responsibility, the lines between good and evil, right and wrong, legal and illegal, are not so neatly drawn. In these situations, too, mental illness terms may be used strategically to obscure guilt, to resolve ambivalence, to bring about a result justified by compassion, and so forth. Long before the days of modern psychiatry, Shakespeare laid bare this tactical use of the idea of madness. Aided and abetted by his wife, Macbeth murders his way to the pinnacle of political power. His victory is spoiled, however. Lady Macbeth starts to hallucinate blood on her hands, is tormented by anguish, cannot rest or sleep. Her husband concludes that she is sick and sends for the doctor. But the doctor wants none of it. He tells Macbeth that his wife is not so sick, my lord, as she is troubled with thick-coming fancies that keep her from her rest. Macbeth is not satisfied. He presses the doctor with these immortal lines. Cure her of that. Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased? Pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow. Raise out the written troubles of the brain. And with some sweet, oblivious antidote, cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff, which weighs upon her heart. The doctor, however, recognizes that what ails this patient is not a disease. His famous answer is, therein the patient must minister to himself. Lady Macbeth is not sick. She feels guilty for the wrong she has committed. Her husband knows this, but does not want to admit it. The modern psychiatrist and the modern popular mind accept and legitimize precisely that intellectual and moral evasion which the doctor in Macbeth repudiates. One of the crassest examples of the use of mental illness terms to obscure moral conflicts and avoid political decision-making occurs in the relationship between psychiatrists and pregnant women. Since times immemorial, some pregnant women and their husbands or lovers have sought abortions. Until recently, performing abortions was medically unsafe as well as legally prohibited. In the post-World War II years, it became fashionable, in the United States as well as elsewhere, to allow pregnant women to have therapeutic abortions based not only on objectively verifiable medical criteria, such as severe renal disease with hypertension, but also on subjective and unverifiable psychiatric criteria, such as mental illness. For example, in 1968, a new abortion law was enacted in California permitting therapeutic abortions on mental health grounds. During the first 6 months of that year, almost 2,000 women were found to require therapeutic abortions to safeguard their mental health, while only 155 abortions were done to safeguard a woman's physical health. By the time the first 9 months of 1968 had elapsed, 5,000 therapeutic abortions were performed in California, virtually all of them for psychiatric reasons. In the 1970s, when abortion was legalized, the psychiatric disabilities so common to pregnant women disappeared just as suddenly as they had appeared 2 decades earlier. Thus, whenever and wherever abortion on demand is illegal, but psychiatric therapeutic abortion is legal, the psychiatrist who prescribes an abortion follows in the footsteps of the physician who, during Prohibition, prescribed liquor. Another arena in which mental illness terms are used to obscure moral conflict and evade personal responsibility is in connection with so-called drug abuse. The use of illegal psychoactive substances is now widespread throughout the world. Although it is obvious that no one is compelled to use such substances, and that therefore, in the final analysis, people take drugs because they want to take them, and although it is also obvious that there are many complex cultural, religious, and legal reasons for the so-called drug problem, it is now fashionable to attribute the problem to the drug-abusing person's mental illness. In addition, it is also fashionable to blame the drug itself and those who make it available, both the dope and the pusher being viewed as seducers infecting innocent individuals who then succumb to the mental illness called addiction. Mental illness as denial of human depravity. The last strategic use meaning of mental illness that I want to identify is its invocation to deny the depths of human depravity. We encounter this use of the term typically when a shocking crime, usually dubbed bizarre by the press, is committed, and when the agent of that deed, though unknown, is instantly diagnosed as deranged or psychotic. Revealingly, the press often relapses into making use of the vocabulary of the alienists and mad doctors in describing these alleged mental patients. A typical story, appearing on page 1 of the New York Post on November 13, 1980, was headlined, "Angels Stalk Mad Slasher." The subtitle added, 350-man patrol hunt for knife maniac. This story concerned the search for a knife-wielding assailant who terrorized the Lower East Side of Manhattan and remained at large despite an intense effort to find him. A similar story appeared in the Syracuse Post-Standard on October 10, 1980, a page-1 headline informing the reader, "Cops Hunt Psycho in Slaying of 2 in Buffalo." The first sentence of the UPI story explained further. Several Buffalo area law enforcement agencies joined forces Thursday in a hunt for a deranged, mentally disturbed person who killed 2 black cab drivers and cut their hearts from their bodies. The authorities had no idea who the killer was. All they knew was that he was a psycho. The New York Times uses more elegant language in reporting this sort of news. One of its typical headlines, placed discreetly on page 16, capping a story about a series of bizarre murders, reads as follows. Disturbed suspect is sought in 7 ritualistic killings of coast hikers. The report concerned the murder of 7 women over a period of 15 months along the hiking trails near San Francisco. Although in this case, too, the identity of the killer or killers was an utter mystery to the authorities, the Times tried to tranquilize its readers with the following account. Although there were some dissimilarities in the cases, the 2 decomposing bodies were fully clothed, for example, while the latest victims were apparently forced to disrobe. Sheriff Howenstein said that the evidence pointed strongly to a single, severely disturbed killer. Note that these killings are called ritualistic, to insinuate the idea that the killer is insane. But it seems to me more obvious that what is ritualistic about this and similar cases is not the manner in which the crimes are committed, but the manner in which they are reported. Mental illness terms being used ritualistically to distract the reader from the evident depravity of the men and women who commit such crimes. I wonder indeed what sort of evidence Sheriff Howenstein and other true believers in mental illness would interpret as pointing strongly toward a mentally healthy mass murderer as the culprit. Citing Sheriff Howenstein's opinion about the mental ill health of this unknown killer was, moreover, merely the warm-up. The Times had an even more qualified authority on mental illness waiting in the wings to offer an opinion about the killer. A criminal psychologist's interpretation of evidence collected over the last year also indicated that the killer's mental state was further deteriorating. The 2 murders Friday may have been an effort to call attention to the earlier murders in the same area. These pathetic fantasies are offered to insinuate the idea, now dear to the hearts of American madness mongers, that every depraved act is a cry for help by a victim. But this is a truly perverse interpretation, distracting the observer's attention from the actual victims of crimes by portraying their perpetrators as themselves the victims. Hardly a day passes without the newspapers reporting similar stories couched in such language. What should we make of them? As one see it, such accounts are simply reports of a type of behavior we colloquially call sickening, that is, so disgusting and upsetting that it makes us sick. Of course, the term sick here is used as a metaphoric adjective, intuitively recognized as such by any competent speaker of the English language. So far, probably no one will refute my interpretation. However, my next step, although equally obvious, is more likely to be rejected. I suggest that the idea that these unknown criminals engage in acts that are sickening, or that they themselves are sickening, has been transformed into the idea that they are really sick. But these persons are sick not in the sense in which persons with cancer or heart disease are sick, but only in the sense in which persons who are lovesick are sick. See Chapter 5. Mental illness, strategy, self-deception, deception. I hope I have succeeded in demonstrating that professionals as well as lay people now feel comfortable using a multiplicity of diverse criteria for determining what counts as mental illness. See Chapter 3. And then using that idea to achieve a variety of personal and social goals. Surely, one of the things we can conclude from this is that we have abandoned, assuming we had once begun, defining mental illness descriptively, and have taken, like a duck to water, to defining it strategically. Although my thesis about mental illness as strategy may be persuasive, I realize that it suffers from a fatal flaw. It is too obvious. On the one hand, everyone now seems to believe in mental illness. On the other hand, hardly anyone acts as if he really believes in it. Consider the evidence. 60 million Americans are estimated to smoke cigarettes. They are mentally ill, suffering from tobacco dependence. 30 million Americans are said to use illegal drugs. They are mentally ill, suffering from drug abuse. 4 million Americans are supposed to have schizophrenia. This disease is generally acknowledged to be the #1 health problem in the United States. Leaders in medicine, psychiatry, government, education, industry, and labor ceaselessly proclaim that mental illness is like any other illness. Nevertheless, responding to a Gallup poll survey asking Americans, "What disease or illness do you fear the most?" the respondents placed cancer on top of the list, blindness halfway down the middle, and deafness at the bottom. Mental illness was not on the list at all. In short, the meaning of the phrase menial illness, like the meaning of any other ideologically loaded symbol, depends on what those who use it want it to mean. Obviously, the ritualistic use of this term means one thing to true believers in psychiatry, and quite another thing to those who reject the dogma of the transubstantiation of personal problems into medical diseases. Cui bono? As I have noted at the beginning of this chapter, one of the crucial differences between descriptive and prescriptive statements is that while the former may be said to be true or false, the latter may only be said to be desirable or undesirable. This distinction is dramatically revealed in the history of Christianity. From its inception until the dawn of the Enlightenment, belief in God and Jesus was premised on the conviction that the scriptures and the teachings of clerics were true. Since the end of the age of faith to our own day, religion has been defended not so much as true, but as useful. Of course, long ago Plato called salutary myths noble lies. Nietzsche aptly renamed them holy lies. The psychiatric myths, useful for supporting faith in the myriad pseudo-medical procedures of the therapeutic state, are our noble, holy, therapeutic lies. One of the most important differences between whether a statement is true or useful is that truth is typically impersonal and universal, whereas usefulness is not. If a person asserts that lead is heavier than water, it is senseless to ask the classic Roman question, cut bono, who profits from it? Whereas if a person asserts that alcoholism is an illness, it is very sensible indeed to ask cui bono. I have devoted much of this work, and especially this chapter, to showing the importance of asking and answering this question whenever a person or group advances a claim clothed in the mantle of mental illness. Hobbes, whom I often cite in this book, concluded Leviathan by urging precisely this point of view on his readers. By substituting clinical for clerical images and words in his text, his message is as timely now as it was in 1651. He that received benefit by a fact is presumed to be the author. Cicero makes honorable mention of one of the Cassi, a severe judge amongst the Romans, for a custom he had in criminal causes, when the testimony of the witnesses was not sufficient, to ask the accusers cui bono, that is to say, what profit, honor, or other contentment the accuser obtained or expected by the fact. For amongst presumptions there is none that so evidently declared the author, as doth the benefit of the action. And therefore by the aforesaid rule of cui bono, we may justly pronounce for the authors of all this spiritual darkness, the Pope and Roman clergy, and all those besides, that endeavor to settle in the minds of men this erroneous doctrine, that the Church now on earth is that kingdom of God mentioned in the Old and New Testament. This may sound old-fashioned, but if so, it is only because of the language. We now have our own expression for cui bono, the bottom line. The bottom line indeed remains. Who profits, in our case, from the psychiatric ideas and interventions so strenuously promoted in the modern world? Hobbes, of course, always saw the struggle for power as the hidden agenda behind clerical fraud and force disguised as benevolence, and we could do worse than heed his advice. But cui bono, what profit did they, the presbytery, expect from it? He writes in one of his typical passages. The same which the popes expected, to have a sovereign power over the people. This formula is still valid. We must extend it, however, because today, in addition to psychiatrists, many others use psychiatric ideas and interventions to gain power over their adversaries or secure other advantages for themselves.